You know, most people that I know like grapes, at least in some form. Some people like to eat just the fruit, like a table grape. Other people enjoy grape juice or perhaps wine. Other people still like raisins, which are dried grapes that are often used for baking and for other treats. We live in a region where a lot of grapes are grown. And this time of year, wintertime, is when the grape plants get pruned so that they produce the most amount of fruit. But there's another reason why they get pruned. Some plants, by their very nature, need to be tamed. Left to their own devices, they'll just grow all out of control, and they'll produce nothing but huge amounts of vegetative growth. You can see this in wild grapes that are growing in the woods or in old fields. Because a grape plant can grow 12 feet or longer in just one growing season, if not kept in check, grape plants can blow all out of control and cause disaster on your property. So here's a scenario that happens all the time. A bird eats a grape and carries the seed with it. It releases the seed and a new grape plant sprouts up. In the first year, it may only grow 6, 12, 18 inches long. But after that, once it becomes established, it will grow many, many feet per year. It seems unthinkable to many people, but a grapevine can actually decimate a forest. It can topple mature trees. I've seen this lots and lots of places where a grapevine will grow up the tree, entangle it, surround it, encircle it, and the restriction against the branches starts to make the leaves so that they aren't able to process the sun through photosynthesis. And then they become weak. And then the sheer weight of the grapevine actually weighs down that tree and it can topple it to the ground. Encircling and entangling are two really good descriptive terms to describe what a grape plant will do. And it's also an image of something that's going on in Hebrews chapter 12. So if you have a Bible with you, open up to Hebrews chapter 12. We're going to be in verses 1 through 3 today. Again, that's Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. And this is what it says. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. If we put this in its proper context, chapter 11 of Hebrews is that hall of fame of people of faith. And so the writer of Hebrews actually goes through a laundry list of people in the Bible who kept their faith despite the odds stacked against them. And those are the people that are referred to in Hebrews chapter 12, that were surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses. The image that's used here by Paul is one of a stadium where a race would be taking place. This was commonplace in the first century in Paul's world. And so there would have been a foot race, and the crowd would be cheering people on. This is a long race that Paul is referring to, an endurance race, one that you need to keep going and going and going in. And the fascinating thing that Paul uses, he's a master with words, is that he talks about this cloud of witnesses surrounding the current Christians who are going through difficulty. They are literally on every side of them, cheering them on. But so too is another word that describes the sin that can trip us up in the race in our faith. The sin that so easily entangles. It literally means to surround or to overwhelm something. Like the grapevines that overwhelm trees and other vegetation and can knock down entire forests. Sin is like that. So Paul encourages the Christians he's writing to focus on the witnesses, the Christians who have been faithful, who are surrounding them, and to let go, get rid of the sin that so easily entangles or surrounds. Eventually, it can surround us in our lives and take over completely. And Paul doesn't mince words here. He lets the Christians know that this race is a long race and that we have one goal, to finish it. And so we need some help for that to take place. And Paul reminds us that the best place to look for help is not just that cloud of witnesses, but Jesus Christ himself, who is the author and the perfecter of our faith. Yes, he endured hardship. He ran a long, hard race that was full of all kinds of trials, and he didn't give up. And Paul reminds those Christians he writes to, don't give up. Look to Jesus, endure, get rid of sin. Don't let it entangle you. I want to spend a few moments describing how I've observed sin work. A couple of months ago, I made a message that was called Bullseye, and it talked about missing the mark, that's a form of sin when we miss the mark of the standard that God has set for our lives. Sin is, Paul describes it here in Hebrews chapter 12, sin that so easily entangles us, is something that weighs us down over time. And as I mentioned earlier, oftentimes new grape plants will start from seed, from a bird eating the grape and then pooping out the seed. Or an existing plant, wherever that vine touches the ground, it will actually put out new roots, which multiplies its capacity to be able to process nutrients and makes the plant grow more and more and more. It'll send out more shoots. And over time, one plant can actually become hundreds of plants, literally. And sin operates like that in our lives. Oftentimes, sin starts out as a tiny little issue. It's barely even noticeable. But we don't confess it, we don't deal with it, and then it blows all out of control. And the longer it goes that we don't address the issue, the greater the fallout from that sin. Like unpruned grape plants, that sin ends up becoming more and more difficult to get under control. And it gets to a point where we may even feel embarrassed to confess that sin or come clean about what's going on in our lives. And so darkness shrouds our lives and we have to live this secret life. You, believe it or not, can be set free from things like pornography and gluttony and perpetual lying and stealing and cheating. But you have to start by confessing the sin. You have to come clean. You have to start the repair process. And that starts by talking to God about it. And in many cases, it requires enlisting the help of others to enable you to be accountable. Ask the hard questions in your life so that you aren't entangled by sin. Part of the Christian faith is to routinely evaluate our lives, to be real and honest about what we see going on in them, and then to cut out what we know is not from God. If we nip it in the bud, it's so much easier to deal with than when we've got this gigantic, out of control sin problem in our lives. And yet God is faithful. I've seen people in the depths of despair, in the middle of affairs and pornographic addictions, in situations where they've got so many lies that they can't even keep their story straight, and yet God has used their humility, their willingness to confess that sin in their lives, to start anew, to trim out the old and bad and evil and sin, and to start with something good. See, grapes inherently aren't a bad plant. We get lots of good things from them. And the choices in our lives are a lot that way too. See, so many things aren't good or bad. Money isn't necessarily good or bad. The words that we use speaking isn't necessarily good or bad. Sexuality is given to us as a gift. It may be good or bad. But so many of these things, when they're used appropriately, are fine, acceptable, even godly. It's when they're distorted, when they're used as ill-intended by God, that they cause problems in our lives. I'm praying today that you would have the courage to be honest about the sin that entangles your life. Some of you know exactly what I'm talking about because it weighs so heavy. It's like a tree that has the burden of a wild grapevine pulling on it constantly. And maybe today, through confession and honesty, and having some really honest conversations with the people around you that love you and you love them, you can be set free by God's grace and start a whole new journey. New growth, healthy growth, growth that is godly and good. I'm praying that you would have the courage to look inward and be honest. May God bless you and reward you as you seek Him with all your heart. Amen.